Alright, you guys, we are talking Shakespeare today. I don't know about you, but I'm super excited. Now, any of you who are sitting there going, oh no, we're talking about Shakespeare, I'm going to tell you, this is going to be fabulous. Alright, if you're not giving Shakespeare a fair shot, you're not doing justice to yourself. Now, of course, you're sitting here thinking, well, you're an English teacher. Yeah, I am. You're right. But you know what? That doesn't mean that Shakespeare is not quality and doesn't think about things and present them in a really interesting way. We're going to be reading Measure for Measure in class, and I can guarantee you that if you stick with it, by the end you're going to be yelling about some sort of injustice that just happened. You're going to be, happy about some things that happened. It's very good at generating emotion in a person. All right, so you really want to make sure that you are kind of thinking about it in those terms. All right, so let's get into it then. What are the things I really want to point out to you? Well, I want to point out that reading Shakespeare takes some practice. All right, we're reading it over the course of 2 weeks. That's really fast. But you know what? It's worth it. So here are some tips to make you successful in this venture, reading Shakespeare. Give yourself enough time. All right, don't try to read it in the 10 minutes before class. Give yourself enough time because sometimes you might want to reread something or just be able to have the time to read through it all. All right, and give yourself a quiet place to think without distractions. That's really important. Okay, you don't want to be sitting there, and take notes. Super, 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 super important. So I want to talk to you about a few things. All right, so when it comes to Shakespeare, at the time that he wrote this, you might think, everybody got it. Everybody talked like this. Yeah, of course they understood it. He was popular, that's true, but that doesn't mean that everyone understood what he was saying. Okay, Shakespeare invented 400 words over the plays and poems that he wrote, mostly plays. And, those are only the words that stuck around in English. There were some, words that were used as slang and as a fad, right? But over time, those kind of disappeared. But no, there's 400 that are still in almost daily use. That's pretty interesting to think about. Now, he also combined a lot of words. All right, so when you see words that are combined with a hyphen or like a little dash, what you want to do is try to figure out what it could be doing. All right, so demi-puppets, for example. Let's kind of parse that one out. So demi means partial, all right? It's from, we see it in demigod, right, where a person is, or a being, I guess I would say, is half human and half God, right? So it's that idea of, kind of split between two. And so we've got this idea of partial or split between two and puppets, right? Puppets suggest control. So then we have this person, then we're assuming, because characters in the play are usually human, unless there's a bear. I'll show you an example of that later. It doesn't come up in our play, but it's actually really fun. So I have to share it. So we have this idea of demi-puppets, right, of partial control, right? This person isn't necessarily acting on their own free will, right? So you just want to think it through, think through the potential for these two words and what they could mean mashed together. All right. If you want to read a little bit more about this, check out the piece that the British Library put out there. David Crystal is actually a pretty solid scholar, but he writes in a way that anyone can understand. So if you're curious about language and how it evolves and how Shakespeare helped it evolve, definitely check it out. Okay. So let's go back to the way I said we should take notes, right? So obviously, if we've got words like demi-puppet, you kind of want to write little notes for yourself so you don't forget what it was that you interpreted these words as. Be flexible in the way that you take notes, okay? Make notes that make sense for you. Don't take notes for me, right? Don't take notes that, you think I would want you to take. Take notes that you feel help you, okay? So highlight important parts or rephrase complicated language so that when you look back on it, you know what it's talking about. All right, so let's, for example, take a look at The Tempest, okay, Act 2, Scene 1, lines 23 through 46. Right, so that's like a 23-line chunk. My note from my book when I looked it up was everyone always gives Gonzalo shit for not being a huge asshole all the time. All right? Now, you might say that doesn't sound like an English teacher note, and you know what? You'd be right. But the thing that helps me is because it kind of makes it funny, right? Like, we all know a guy like Gonzalo. All right, he's just trying to do the right thing, and everyone's harping on him always. And so pointing it out in a way that, like, maybe I would talk to my friends, makes it stick in my brain. All right, so you really want to make sure that you write your notes in a way that helps the ideas stick in there. All right, now, of course, say you decide to write an essay on Measure for Measure, or you're writing your discussion board post. You want to clean that up a little bit to make it not quite as explicit, but you definitely, could use that to jog your memory. Highlighting and making notes is amazing, but it's only amazing if you have them with you during our discussions in class. That makes sense, right? You need to have them available to you so you can look back at them, right? So you can kind of follow along, you can identify your analysis, you can, see how your analysis matches up with other people's. All right, so download the PDF, make some comments digitally if you want to. If you want to print them out and bring, have those with you to refer to, also cool, because you can handwrite notes on those. So you have options. Now, some things to remember. Okay, this is a play. We don't see faces. Plays are really ultimately just like movies. But when we watch a movie, we see people visually. When we read a play, we don't have that visual confirmation. So you might not remember the name of a character that showed up 2 scenes ago, that you have to just go back and check real quick, all right? Make sure you give yourself the opportunity to do that, okay? So just look back at the Dramatus Personai, also known as characters in the play. That's what it's called in our edition, characters in the play. But I wanted to introduce you to the term Dramatus Personae in case you ever saw it anywhere else. Now you know. It's just basically characters in the play. Gives you a little note about who they are and what their name is. So it kind of helps you along with your analysis a little bit. Gives you a baseline. All right, also read the stage directions. They might not sound important because, no one's saying them, but they let you know who is where, who's hiding, who's, doing something that maybe we should know about. Now, let's pop back to that Dramatus Personae. All right. Again, like I said, characters in the play, but it's fun because it's got that weird little AE thing, okay, in the Latin. So it shows the relationships between characters, which is really awesome. So, for example, in Measure for Measure, we have the Duke of Vienna, later called Friar Lodovick. So, okay, cool. We know that he's going to be called 2 things in this play, and it helps us identify that right off the bat. We also know that Aeschylus is a judge, so we know that he works in the law. We have Elbow, who's a constable, and Mistress Overdone, who is a bawd. Now, if you don't understand the term bawd, obviously look it up in the dictionary, but it's basically she's a madam. She runs a brothel, okay? So just, we can find out a lot of things about these characters and make some judgments about them before we even get started, right? Like, my first judgment would be it's kind of shady that the Duke dresses up as a friar. Spoiler alert, I feel that way throughout the entirety of the play. Entirely problematic, and you'll hear me rant about it. So, stay tuned, and we can talk about how complicated and disturbing and just difficult it is that a political figure is impersonating a friar. All right, so what happens if you try to read a play without knowing anything about the characters? You're not going to have any idea of how they relate to one another. So don't do that to yourself. If you wanted to, say, print out 1 page of this near you, so maybe a screenshot, if you can have it pulled up on a tablet or your phone to refer back to as you're reading, print it out just to make it easier for you. And then stage directions, right? I told you earlier that there was bears. Well, here is a legitimate stage direction from The Winter's Tale. Exit pursued by bear. It's complicated. We don't see him again. Yeah. But essentially, stage directions are just there so that you know who's coming into the scene, who's leaving it, who's sneaking, who's hiding, right? Because guess what? We kind of need to know that. If someone's like listening in on someone else's conversation and they're hiding while they do it, we need to know. If someone is hiding because they don't want to get caught, we kind of need to know, but we might not get an indication of that verbally. Now, remember, usually we can only read what characters are saying out loud. Okay? There is only a few rare instances in which we could also have that extended to their thoughts, and that's something called an aside. All right? When that happens, I mean, if you were watching the play, what would basically happen is a big spotlight would come on and shine on this one character that's speaking. Everybody else would be in darkness to kind of suggest that they're just, and they'd be kind of like frozen wherever they are, And so that's kind of how you want to think of it. If you see the word aside, okay, this person's talking, no one else can hear it, and this is what they really think. Otherwise, it's up for grabs. Characters in plays are just like humans in the sense that, you know what, they might be telling the truth, they might be lying. Difficult to tell, got to get to know the character. All right, so keep that in mind. So you might ask yourself, what does it matter that we're making such a big deal about the fact that we can't see characters' body language? Think about how, in just general communication, body language is at least half of the conversation. All right, if someone's acting all squirrely and like this, and they're all kind of hiding within themselves, right, you get an idea that they're not really digging the conversation. If they're acting all loosey-goosey and, a little extra giggly, you might be thinking, okay, well, this person might be a little drunk, right? So the same thing happens in a play, but since we're reading it instead of viewing it, we don't get to see that. All right, so we have to read the stage directions to know kind of the character's state of mind and how they're interacting in the scene. All right, so if I haven't convinced you yet that Shakespeare's pretty rad, 400 new words in the English language is really cool, in my opinion. But if I haven't convinced you yet, you should know Shakespeare's works are full of dirty jokes. If you want to make it your mission for the rest of our class sessions to find those dirty jokes, point them out, laugh at them, go for it. All right, so I want to give you some context on the early modern period here. The dude to the left is King James. So he reportedly said, "Kings are justly called gods because they exercise a manner or resemblance of divine power upon earth." Seems a little self-important, doesn't he? Yes, he does. I will answer that question for you. Yeah, he believes he was bestowed by the power of God to rule his people. Interesting thought. I don't know, James. I don't know. But let's continue here. So there's some things that we need to know. Okay? We need to know some context about King James, because guess what? Shakespeare was putting these plays on for him. If it weren't for the king or queen at the time, Queen Elizabeth before James and King James at the time of Measure for Measure, it may very well not have been deemed important enough to survive. But Shakespeare was putting on these plays for the royal court, so that's really important. That tells us a couple of things. He needs to stay in favor with the king. There's also some religious imagery that we want to keep in mind, and then also the humors. So let's get into these things. Now, King James I. If you happen to see the TV show Reign, it used to be on the CW, but it ended a bit ago. Now it's on Netflix. It's all about Mary Queen of Scots and kind of her escapades, I guess you could say. But she is King James's mom. All right, so just to kind of put that in historical context. He also is the one who commissioned the King James version of the Bible. I know I have a couple of those at home from when I was younger. It's a really common version of the Bible that probably a lot of you have. All right. He also believed in the divine right of kings, which is what we were talking about before. So it's that belief that the king or queen was the embodiment of God in human form, and that they were given the power to rule through God or by God. All right, and I want to make a quick note that we don't see kings and queens in the play that we're reading here, but we do see a duke, and that same kind of power is also bestowed on the duke as well. All right, and during his rule, James used the divine right of kings to suppress both Puritans and Catholics who objected to this idea of the divine right. If you haven't gathered, by this point, there was a huge religious kind of controversy happening. Everyone was trying to say that their religion was correct. Different monarchs had different religions that they prioritized. So with one monarch, okay, we're Protestant. With another one, we're Catholic. And I mean, in all honesty, this whole thing started with Henry VIII, I guess probably about 130 years earlier, when he marched down to Rome and said, okay, Pope, give me a divorce. Pope says no. Then Henry VIII decides to not be part of the Catholic Church anymore. He creates his own church, the Church of England. It's still around. And he makes the rules. So guess what? You can get a divorce. Kind of a fancy way to do religion, wouldn't you say? Yeah. You can get what you want that way if you make your own. So, since then, things have been in turmoil, constant fighting between different groups, and it's that way definitely in England and then throughout other parts of Europe as well. Think Spanish Inquisition, that kind of thing. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about the use of religion. We can see religion like everywhere in anything written during the early modern period, which Shakespeare is part of. All right, so there's constant nods to religion, religious right, that kind of thing. And this is where the context for, the little battle that we're having between Protestants and Catholics, we can see that they've been fighting back and forth for dominance. And honestly, King James he's not having it. Like, the monarchs before him have been choosing their own religion. It's been throwing the country into turmoil. And he's kind of self-centered. Like, if you read anything about him, you'll kind of get that vibe. So he's basically just like, everyone shut up and listen to me, right? That's what he's about. It's not a direct quote, but yeah, he very well might have said it. Now, in Measure for Measure, Shakespeare uses Antonio and the Duke to kind of show that religious conflict. So if you want to think about that further as you read, it's definitely a really cool avenue to go down. And then just briefly to talk about the humors, this chart here, it looks weird. There is weird stuff on here. But it's important to know that each of these are symbolic because of the belief in something called the humors. It's the same reason why, bloodletting was such an important concept, kind of during this time. It was such an important treatment. Now, writing about Shakespeare. So, how to format Shakespeare's language in MLA. Right? Pretty cool. We got to do that. You cite it a little differently because Shakespeare is Shakespeare. No, I'm kidding. It's because it's a play, right? So we cite plays a little bit differently. The title of the play goes in italics. It's a long form work, so that is kind of expected. To cite plays in text, we use act, scene, line formatting. You'll notice in your PDF of the play, on one of the tops, like one of the sides on top, you'll notice it'll tell you act whatever, scene whatever, and then the line numbers are on the sides. The line numbers don't get added into your quotation, but what they do is they get added into your citation, right? So citation, not quotation. All right, so we use the space/space method in plays just like we do in poetry because of the fact that this is still written in poetic form, okay? Technically, it's iambic pentameter, but we don't need to go into that. That's a little too technical. All right, let's just say that it mimics a typical conversation. All right, so for example, right, do not give dalliance too much the rein. The strongest oaths are straw to the fire and the blood. Yeah, there's some weird apostrophes and things like that, but if you struggle to read it, try to read it out loud. It'll make more sense. But the thing I want to point out here is that our citation would be Shakespeare 4.1.51 to 53, right? 51 to 3. And that is Act 4, Scene 1, lines 51 to 53. Nice and easy. All right, you just need all the parts because guess what? All like the line numbers reset themselves at the beginning of every scene. So you really need to show the reader kind of what's happening there, like where you're reading. All right, some other things about quoting Shakespeare. Make sure to double check that autocorrect doesn't remove anything that's out of place and weird, because Shakespeare is all about out of place and weird. All right, it's important. So when you are writing about it, whether, like I said, in your discussion post or in your essay, if you decide to write on measure for measure, you want to cite the quote, right? Use the quote, identify the quote, and then explain what it means for the reader. So Prospero advises Ferdinand, do not give dalliance too much the rain, the strongest oats or straw to the fire and the blood, right? Because we introduced this quotation with Prospero and Ferdinand, and Prospero advising Ferdinand. We've got our introduction there, our introductory phrase. Awesome. We have our quotation. We have our citation. We've now done it, right? We've done the magic. But we're not finished yet. And because in the next sentence, you want to explain, like, what in the world is this interpretation? How do you interpret what Prospero advises Ferdinand? Okay? Then, in the next sentence, you explain how that analysis relates back to your argument, whatever it is you're trying to share with the reader. Okay? Now, when you're quoting, make sure the reader knows who's speaking. Just like in the last slide, that when I pointed out, Prospero advises Ferdinand, you want to make sure that you're identifying the character. If you just say, Shakespeare says, I'm going to be like, oh my gosh, there's like 30 people in there. How am I going to figure out which character you're talking about? No, don't do that to me. You're going to make me stressed out and trying to do so much extra work. Just identify the character. If the Duke says something, say that the Duke says it. It's really important you identify where language comes from. Since there are so many characters, then we can't just identify it by the author. If you identify something that's a little bit more general, right? Something like Shakespeare uses Vienna as a microcosm of England, right? As a representation of England, basically a symbol of England, with factions resisting each other to achieve dominance. Since you're talking about Shakespeare, the author, yes, absolutely. Please use Shakespeare's name. Please. All right? But when you're talking about something a character said, you need to tell me what character said it. That's really, really important. Otherwise, we're all going to be very confused. Okay? So keep that in mind. All right, so that is Shakespeare in a nutshell. It's important to keep these things in mind, right? We're moving into new territory here in terms of reading a play that maybe we're not really familiar with or haven't read language like this in a while. So thank you so much for following through to the end. Have a great rest of your day, and I will see you next time.